Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So, this is my first video episode back after Christmas and New Year's, which is nice. It's really exciting. Yeah, really nice to be back. As you can see, there's a slight change to my setup in that I have my microphone, so that's very fun. I've now got to work out overlaying this audio with this video because the audio is going through my laptop and the video is going through my phone. So, I'll figure that out in iMovie. No promo, I guess. But yeah, we'll see. I'm sure it'll be fine, but the sound quality is definitely so much better with the microphone, which is great. And yeah, I'm very close to the camera right now, but we'll see. Hopefully, we're all good. So today, we're veering back into the psychology kind of vibe that I was giving before Christmas, and this was inspired by an episode of the Arts and Ideas podcast on BBC Sounds, which has been the inspiration for a lot of my kind of ideas, my video essays, my audio essays. And so today we're going to be talking about the call to evil. So what is evil? What makes people evil? And what really we can truly, the kind of the grey areas within all that. So without further ado, let's get going. So in definition, evil is an act that hinders a person's ability to function, which is very interesting. So this is, you do something, say for example, you break someone's leg, and then that hinders their ability to function, that hinders their ability to walk, for example. So in some, if not most contexts, then yes, it is hindering a person's ability to function, whether, it's something from murder to stealing, for example. But there are further layers to this question, and that definition doesn't necessarily encompass all the facets of evil, right? So this definition classes evil as an act. Evil is an act by this definition. Whereas realistically, could we say that a thought is evil? Or, if you considered or thought about, how awful somebody was, or you thought about doing terrible things to somebody, is that still evil? Does that still make you an evil person? Or rather, is the evil only manifest in actually doing those things to that person, for example? Can a single person be evil, totally evil? Or are there more kind of grey areas? Um, so someone can be classified as evil due to their actions, and there seem to be somewhat different categories. You can hear that I'm using very flimsy kind of proposing language here as well, due to the nature of this question. Evil is kind of one of those philosophical ideas that we can't really fully define, and so that's why, in part, I thought this podcast episode and also this topic was really interesting to talk about. So, on different scales, genocide, murder, stealing, lying, where do these things lie, and is evil a sliding scale or just a facet of human nature? So, talking about the origins of evil, so there's original sin in the Christian faith, which professes some element of inherent wrongdoing in everyone. To sin may not be to be evil, but it is all very subjective, and therefore not only makes the conversation more nuanced, but also highly subjective and distinctive per person, highly individualized. How responsible can one be for their own evil? The nature versus nurture question, for example, comes up frequently, as well as the discussion of circumstance. So, going back to the idea of stealing, are you stealing because you can't afford food, for example? Are you stealing just for the thrill of it? And where do these lie on evil? Where do these lie on this act hindering a person's ability to raise funds from their shop, for example? And in the nature side of things, we could talk about psychopaths or sociopaths and how do those conditions make one more liable to be evil, or is that a misconstruction by Hollywood, for example? I think an example that pops to mind is the Joker, right? The Joker path. The Joker is always cited as a psychopath, right? But does that put a bad badge on psychopathy, or is it a tried and tested correlation? It's interesting to really consider these things. Not every psychopath and not every sociopath are murderers, for example, which is the kind of socialized idea. Um, but that again reveals how there are layers to this evil question and also layers to human beings in general. Just because somebody is schizophrenic, for example, doesn't mean that that is all they are. And just because somebody has, say, lied once or done something evil, perhaps on a smaller scale, that doesn't necessarily define them as a person. So, in her thesis, Tiffany Ann Bickett discusses the kind of origins of evil and also different kinds of evil and what evil really means. So, citing Freud, we love, Freud kind of argues that evil is the result of humans releasing their true nature and their innate urges in a society that otherwise suppresses them due to social values and morals. And there's an intriguing layer to this in that our definition of evil comes from the social definition of morality, right? Evil is only evil in comparison to goodness, in comparison to morality. And evil as a kind of floaty concept is different to evil as dictated by the law. And so Freud, in that way, is hitting the nail on the head in that it, and perhaps Freud doesn't articulate it in this way, but it is our values that dictate what is evil, and different people have different values. And so, taking a kind of shallower example, lying, somebody could tell a lie because they don't hurt someone's feelings or are protecting somebody, but other people could see that lie as being evil because you're not being good and being truthful. And how all characteristics are split into kind of good and bad as well is very, very interesting. Different cultures have different values, and so we'll see different things as evil as well. So again, you see how it's all very individualized and subjective. Now, so while we're on Freud, it's this is a guy who came up with a complex, an Oedipus complex, talking about sexual urges towards the mother and therefore loathing the father, etc. Don't know what that says about you, but anywho, so I don't agree with a lot of Freud's kind of ideas, uh, and this idea of the kind of revelation of a true nature, it doesn't kind of fully sit with me, right? I think that, assuming that all humans are innately evil or assuming that are they have this inherent kind of need for violence, I think is a very misconstrued and even dangerous way of looking at things. Because if you say that all people have this kind of suppressed violence within them, suppressed aggression, does that in a way endorse very aggressive behavior or violent behavior? When we see it on the news, does it say that does endorsing this argument then mean that, oh, well, murder, somebody murders somebody, it's just their inner self coming out? It makes placing blame very fuzzy. And when it comes to law, again, kind of sticks its oar in the wrong place. Um, and so, yeah, I don't really agree with the fact that humans are inherently evil because I don't think they are. I think everyone can have fits of anger and everyone can do evil. Everyone has the capacity to do evil, but it doesn't mean that at their core that is what they are and can be defined. On another level, Hannah Arendt, I hope I said that right, says that evil can be done by anyone and even without any evil intent. And I agree with this more. I think, again, that kind of links that idea of that anyone has the capacity to do evil. It's just the circumstances, for example, which again is that kind of nature versus nurture question. Within everyone there is passion and there is fight, kind of fight or flight kind of idea, where in a particular situation, evil may have to be done or evil may be done. And just because somebody does something that others deem evil, it may not mean that they intended that to be the case. And I think that's an important kind of thing to remember because I think it puts everyone on a level playing field. And of course, there are people who are more evil than others. Um, for example, comparing your best friend with Adolf Hitler. Um, and, I guess there are groups of people who say that Hitler wasn't evil out there in the world. And again, it speaks to the subjectivity of the word evil. It's an abstract thing, right? So you can't define it so precisely. I'm sure that the general global view of Hitler is not that he was good, but you understand the point. They discuss this to a great extent in the BBC Sounds podcast, the Arts and Ideas podcast. And it was very, very interesting. So, to give a brief overview, the Stanford Prison Experiment involved college students, where one group were the prisoners and the other group were the guards. And so they basically watch and view these students and see how they're going to act. Do they see that these people who were previously on a level playing field suddenly become, there's this change, there's a shift in power dynamics. Do the guards suddenly become violent, or do they become kind of arrogant in their positions? Do the prisoners become suppressed, or do they rally together and rise up? How do these dynamics kind of play out in a forced or experimental environment? Now, the even darker side to this experiment is that it was not regulated as we would now like to regulate something as such. Um, you'd get terrible things being done to the prisoner group, absolutely heinous things. It's absolutely awful. And also that the researchers kind of goaded the guards. So it wasn't a completely unbiased experiment, as it should be to be in any element scientific, but rather it felt kind of like a circus. How they explained it is that the researchers were watching this go on, but they'd essentially told the guards that they had to act a certain way. They'd kind of inferred to the guards that they should become the superior beings, that they should feel and embody that kind of superiority and dominance in that setting. And so it's quite unnerving to hear about. And I think that, I'm glad that by now we've kind of managed to move on from this. And psychologically, it's a very interesting idea because, you plant those ideas in people's heads and then they suppose that that's how they must act, but there's also that supposition that guards and people in advantage and privileged positions will always step on those who are inferior. And, that's a dynamic that is seen again and again. And relating to this kind of call to evil is that everyone has that capacity, or at least this experiment, I guess, was trying to show that everyone has that capacity to become evil, even with people who had previously been your friends. Um, but then you could argue in this case, again, like I'm saying, it's not scientific at all, because in this case, they are acting to the parts that they've been told to play. So very kind of interesting. But I don't think that it is an accurate representation of human nature at all. So going back to this nature versus nurture question and linking to the Stanford Prison experiment is something called the Lucifer effect. So the Lucifer effect is essentially describing people being shaped by their circumstances. So again, in the prison experiment, the idea that if one is a prisoner, they're going to be shaped by the fact that they are a suppressed group. They're going to be shaped by the fact that they are a caged group. Whereas then you have the guards who are shaped by the fact that they are in the more powerful position, and so therefore they have the privilege to kind of act how they will and act free reign, which again does say something about human nature, because it wasn't dictated to them what they should do. And an interesting layer to this, which I believe Freud would like very much, is that they began sexual humiliation. It's worth noting that these were groups of young men, and they began sexually humiliating the prisoners to absolutely dreadful extents. Now if that started happening, people would interfere. Um, but I don't know what that says about society at the time. I don't know what that says about scientific research at the time. But it says something dark, and I'm glad that we're not in those positions anymore. Imagining after the experiment was completed, those students going back to normal life, or rather how things were before. I don't know about that. And also, I suppose it's interesting to contemplate what would have happened if the groups were the other way around. It tends to be that in a suppressed group, you build a community and you're more open, but that isn't always the case. And there are fractions within groups as well. And again, it shows how everyone is shaped by their circumstances. For example, feminism is taken an example. You're shaped by your background, whether you're working class to upper class, whether your political leanings, the colour of your skin, it's all shapes your outlook. So continuing on this kind of what people say about evil, and it's really interesting to see all the different opinions as well. So Kramer, 2014, talks about evil in the context of there being no extenuating circumstances. So previously, we'd had the opinion of Hannah Arendt, who said that evil could be done with anyone without necessarily any evil intent, or that evil as a concept is something that is rooted deep within us, and that at points cannot be avoided. And so in this case, Kramer is discussing the no extenuating circumstance. So, for example, saving yourself over a friend on a dinghy that only has room for one in the middle of an ocean. So by saving yourself, you kill the friend. But how does this feel morally different if it were a stranger, or if you actively killed them rather than jumping onto the raft first? And there's also the layer of if you were on the raft first and simply batted them away because it would sink, or you just get to it first by pure luck and they die on the way, on the swim. How much blame can we take in those different how much blame can we take in those different situations? And can this be called evil, or a moral transgression, or even just survival? And on the morality front, if it was a complete stranger versus a friend, no one knows how they'll feel in that situation. But I suppose if it was a friend, there's more of that emotional connection there. And so, does it make it more evil to kill, in inverted commas, them because you have those memories together? Or is it more evil to kill somebody you don't know because you can be more heartless? It's an interesting one. It's like the trolley problem, right? The classic, the ye olde classic. Whether, do you save one person or do you save five people? And in saving the five and the larger number, which one may think is the better case, in fact is what I do, you have to pull the lever and therefore become an active participant. And that's the thing. If you, in that case, are an active participant in it rather than a passive bystander, does that make what you did worse, even though you've actually saved more people than you've killed? Or, because it was a freak accident, you have no liability whatsoever, even though more people die and you saw what happened. You become a witness, not a partaker. It's interesting. It's all very, very interesting. Interesting layers, interesting layers. So Horn, 2008, discusses evil in relation to a person's other behaviours. So rather than being a fundamental part of one's character, or rather all they are, or indeed being set in comparison to other individuals, which I think is an important point, evil is defined by the badness of the act compared to how a person usually is. So this does become challenging when considering a serial killer, for example, who, most people would think was evil overall. However, if you compare them to their own acts, it may not be evil because it's just the everyday. to put it very crudely. However, on the day-to-day level, it does seem to make sense. If one is usually law-abiding and then stealing a loaf of bread, and stealing a loaf of bread becomes their evil and their transgression. This doesn't take account of their situation, though. So if they can't afford food, for example, their starvation is an evil in itself. Therefore, can we call them evil for their action, even if they are still law-abiding in other ways? Indeed, if starvation is the evil, then are they combating, if by combating that they steal, in relation to their circumstances, what they do is not evil? One could argue here that acts such as murder are inherently evil, which is true in relation to our own actions, since the vast majority of this outlet would not kill. The law and its links to evil is very complex, as I mentioned, with murder being a prime example of surely an arguable evil, with the layers of situations such as self-defense, which combats the killing with the killed's actions. The concept of war also comes in here, whether it be an order or whether it's one's personal motivations that lead one to kill. And then there's things like abortion and the abortion laws. So bodily autonomy is not an evil thing, and yet some are of the opinion that it is because of their religious or social environments. And so there are so many layers to this kind of evil question, and you can go around in circles, as I probably have done right now. um, However, something that does discuss evil very well is our media. Our media is a great representation of maybe the subtle things in our society, but also the kind of overarching themes per se in the real world. So a classic literary example is Lord of the Flies. So it's the classic idea. Desert island, a group of people. It's been done again and again multiple times. They have to just go from scratch, getting food, shelter, etc. And the interesting thing about Lord of the Flies specifically, and why it's such a classic, William Golding, is that it's a group of boys, a group of young boys. So A, how would it be if it was a group of young girls? How would it be different? And then B, how would it be if it was a mixed group? And then, as we've seen in other media that's followed, how is it with adults? Boys or children indeed have less, I'm going to say less moral principles. That sounds quite awful, but they don't understand like social expectation and social morality and morals as adults do. They just don't in that way of, they have the inherent like importance of kindness and things like that, but on a more intellectual level, perhaps in an analytical level, they don't understand morals like adults do. And so when on this island and just a group of young children going from scratch, they automatically fall into this leader follower community, and in fact, a dictatorship. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all people would. And in fact, is that more reflective on the individual who becomes that dictator or leader figure? Or is it more reflective of the group as a whole because they don't stop it or they don't understand how to circumvent it? It's interesting to consider. And I think that humans inherently, there is a need for a leader, and some people do become natural leaders. They just do. Um, but it's what people do with that power, which again links to that Stanford prison experiment. Linking to this and that kind of idea of dictatorship and leadership, the neurobiology of evil. So the writer of the piece that I mentioned earlier cites this feeling of aggression, which can be associated with the neurotransmitters in the amygdala in the brain. However, I do feel that a sense of aggression doesn't necessarily come along with action. You can be really, really angry at somebody, but you wouldn't hurt them physically or even verbally. And, we're talking about this kind of aggressive feeling, it only considers the active sense of evil in a violent manner. And not all evil, quote unquote, has to be physically violent. Indeed, the writer of the piece actually goes on to discuss psychosocial factors and how their intertwining can generate an array of evil, quote unquote, responses. So further, literature in general, there is a lot of evil about. I guess comic books is a good example in that you have your evil and your good characters, and it's always black and white. In Disney films, in children's films, interestingly enough, thinking of the whole children on a desert island idea, um, there are black and white images of good and evil, which teaches children in a way that, you should be careful of people who act in a certain way, which is good. But it also gives them a very unrealistic view of the real world. So there's always these black and white images of good and evil in children's films. And I think this has improved recently. I think that it's nice in more recent years to see more modern takes on good and evil and more layered takes in children's films as well. But traditionally, you always had particular figures painted as evil. And this is also seen in adult media. So talking about horror films, for example, and you have the monsters. And looking into it, it's very interesting, but also very disturbing how a lot of monsters, quote unquote, or the evil beings in the horror genre are sculpted off minority groups, disabled people. It's truly dreadful and very disturbing, and we should really look at ourselves when considering that. And I'd really recommend kind of reading into that. It's very kind of interesting. So, editing Lily back on the record without a microphone, but alas. I just wanted to add a couple things to the stuff that I recorded yesterday. And there are a couple of things that came up in conversation yesterday evening, actually, after I finished recording. But also, I have more brain right now, so that's always handy. And one thing I really wanted to talk about was this kind of inherent desire to rebel. So, linking to Freud's kind of ideas and this inherent evil within people, while as I've expressed, I don't agree that that's particularly there, I do think, and there have been studies where if somebody tells you to do something, especially with children, if somebody tells you to do something, or if somebody tells you a way is a particular way that you have to do something, like the set morals of society, then you will be more likely to rebel against that system. Obviously, this depends on the subject, who's been told these things, and etc. But I think it's really interesting, this essence of evil, or with children rather, like good or bad. It's interesting that things that are said to be bad are actually craved more. The food is the exact same. Foods that are said to be bad, quote unquote, are then seen and lauded as these like incredible things that everyone craves and really wants. So perhaps it is a similar idea. And talking about evil is that by abrupting goodness and by abrupting those rules, one is evil, perhaps, and therefore there is that inherent kind of perhaps not will to be evil, but will to not do good. And so editing Lily returns. Something else I want to talk about, which again was spot by this conversation I had with my friend Ren last night, was this kind of glorification of evil in true crime. But also through the constant barrage of horror media, of these kind of sexy criminals or these sexy bad guys in film. And I think it's really interesting to contemplate. And from a true crime level, since the days of Jack the Ripper to the Yorkshire Ripper, who, by definition, the Yorkshire Ripper is that legacy of lauding of crime and murder by the press. And it was all, Jack the Ripper was the original kind of incarnation of this celebrity murderer. Jack the Ripper was a sensation story. It may not have even been the same person who did all of the crimes. It's one of those things where the media has taken something and construed it in a particular way to make this, to sell papers, basically. And so it's interesting to contemplate evil in that way. Jack the Ripper as a character was a manifestation of evil, was perhaps a manifestation of the fears at the time. Women were being murdered in those regions of London and Whitechapel all of the time. And it's just through the sensation story that brought attention to it, which is good in its own way. But it also wrought horrors, the judgment that people would pass on these women. And then also, as I said, this now continuing legacy of making the serial killer the centre of attention, making the serial killer the merchandise, the bankable star. And there's that much true crime that goes on, that is put out there. And, I don't discredit it. I think it's interesting. And I think, particular angles on cold cases or old cases or anything can be very interesting. But I also think it's very important to consider the real people behind that, to consider the people who lost their lives at those particular instances. And talking about evil in itself, is evil therefore more of a manifestation of the press and this kind of the fame? Is evil more defined by what is the talk, by what people are told somebody is like, and not the actual person themselves? And this comes back to that subjectivity. Evil, goodness, all of these abstract terms are all a matter of opinion. They're all incredibly subjective and individualized, which I've said multiple times throughout this video. And so can we really separate our fantasies from our realities? Another case that came up when we were looking last night and having this lovely old discussion, and I do think this topic is one to really be discussed, which I'm contemplating having much more kind of peer group kind of podcast episodes and video episodes, which I think would be really nice. But we talked about child murderers and how children who kill, where is the line drawn and where is the responsibility placed? It seems extremely arbitrary to suddenly, somebody has the full responsibility as soon as they turn 18. But in the same way, you have, we came across this 12-year-old killer, and there's little bits of research that Ron was doing, and it's, where does the responsibility lie? How can we decree evil? Could you say that that child, because of such extreme actions, planned or plotted murder, an intentional murder, was then coded by something genetically to make them so evil, or to make them do these heinous things as dictated by the law, and also, I would hope, as dictated by some sort of fundamental morality? But also, I suppose in that way you could comment, well, evolution. I know survival of the fittest, I'm a scientist. Survival of the fittest isn't, I'm better than you, I'm fitter than you, I can kill you and survive. It's about resources, it's about environment. But in that way, combat is a natural part of species interaction. It just is, a cooperation and competition from bacteria to us in slightly varying ways. And so, can you say that, well, that child, because children are more connected to those kind of fundamentals of survival, because they haven't entered society yet as adults have done, And so she's like, oh, well, they kill because they saw that threat. But obviously, not all children do that. And people have different backgrounds, such as different upbringings. And so, where is the blame placed? And then, therefore, what is the decree of evil placed on? Is the evil the act or is the evil the person? And this comes back to that relative kind of discussion of evil, in that a person's evil is reticent of the rest of their character. So everyone has their positives and their negatives per se. They have their goodness, their politeness, their kindness, their empathy, their compassion, but they can also have their jealousy, their anger, their venom, their hatred, their violence. And obviously this is all relative, and also, things like anger, perhaps anger projected in different causes. So, for example, political causes, some people would agree with that and therefore see it as a goodness, a good cause, and otherwise people, other people of different views would see that as an evil or something to be suppressed. Again, it's all very relative. But negating that in my own opinions on those things, and referring back to the child murderer, that we know murder is wrong, but when it is a child who does it, one has to question why. There are more layers to this, and people go through psychiatric assessments and assessments of their entire life, basically, their background and everything, and it's just awful to see such things happening in the world when there is, I guess, more of an element of choice there. I think we have to continue to question this glorification of evil. It's been a conversation for a while, especially after the kind of real peak of true crime documentaries on Netflix. But the legacy continues, and I think that the press will continue to glorify these events or speak on these events in quite detailed ways, which has been regulated in more modern times. At the time of Jack the Ripper and everything, it was very bland. There were a lot of details. It was very plain. And so I think that in all of this conversation of evil and goodness, it's important to hear other people's opinions and to really discuss. And so that's kind of these are the things that I can say on my own. And I think that, to really, really get into it, we should have a group of people, because I think that by its very nature, it is a very subjective topic. And so you're only hearing my own views. And I always think it's so valuable to listen to the views of everyone else. If you agree or disagree with somebody, I think it's important to collect that information, and then that can inform your judgments. All right, so that's the end of the video. There may be an added little section before this, because basically my brain just completely combusted and I couldn't think of any words. So I may add a bit in tomorrow. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, this should be coming out on Sunday. I've decided to move my kind of video and podcast releases to Sundays and have written pieces throughout the working week, because just kind of schedule wise, that seems to work better for me. But yeah, I hope that I've articulated myself remotely. But no, I hope you've enjoyed the video and or the podcast if you're listening in. Please let me know what you think. Evil's kind of a fun one. It's a very more conversational one as well, which doing a podcast on my own isn't great. I also researched this quite a while ago, so trying to kind of refresh my memory was a bit difficult. But no, I think we've done some interesting stuff, and yeah, I hope to hear you again next. I always do this. I hope you listen again next time, to have you back. And thank you for all the support on Substack so far. It's really nice, and I hope to keep building a community. But yes, have a lovely week, and I will speak to you soon. Take care, and let's keep talking.